She walked into the bank like any other client, but nothing about her was ordinary. Her heels clicked against the marble floor. Her tailored suit carried the weight of respect earned through decades of work, and her presence alone could have filled the room with silence. This was not just a woman with wealth. This was a woman who built entire companies, a billionaire whose name carried power in every boardroom she entered. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered. The tellers glanced up, eyes darting between each other, as though something about her did not fit. A man in line shifted uncomfortably. A security guard adjusted his stance, hand grazing the side of his belt. The room should have recognized her as a patron, but instead it recognized her as a problem. She approached the counter with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. But the smile that should have greeted her was missing. The teller hesitated, glanced at the manager's office, and then nodded nervously in that direction. A few moments later, the manager himself emerged. His expression was polite at first, but his eyes betrayed a suspicion that clung to every word he spoke. "Can I help you?" he asked, as though the simple act of requesting service required justification. She explained what she needed, nothing out of the ordinary, yet his demeanor hardened. He demanded additional documents, asked questions that weren't policy, and shifted from professional to hostile in a matter of seconds. The lobby grew tense, whispers rising like smoke in the air. Customers waiting nearby leaned in, some frowning, others pulling back as though watching a scene they didn't want to be part of. Here she was, a woman who employed thousands, a leader whose signature moved millions across borders, being treated as though she were attempting something criminal. Her voice remained steady, her patience remarkable. But each response she gave was met with another demand, another insinuation, another reminder that in his eyes, she did not belong. That was when the moment shifted. He told her flatly that he could not process her request. No apology, no explanation that made sense, just a wall built from arrogance and prejudice. The disbelief in the room was heavy. A billionaire CEO standing inside her own bank branch, being refused access to her own money. She straightened her posture, her gaze fixed firmly on his. Her silence carried more authority than his entire tirade. And then calmly she said words that would change the course of his life forever. But before we reach that moment, pause here for just a second. If stories like this grip you, if you believe voices like hers must be heard, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. And in the comments, tell me the country you're watching from. Because stories like this aren't just about one person. They're about all of us, and where we stand when dignity is denied. Now, back to that lobby. The atmosphere was electric with disbelief. The customers around her sensed the wrongness of what they were witnessing. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering, "Why won't they help her?" A young man with his phone in hand quietly started recording. The manager, oblivious to the weight of what he was doing, folded his arms with smug satisfaction, convinced he had the upper hand. But she had not built an empire by accepting humiliation. She did not rise from nothing to billions by letting small men with small minds decide her worth. She leaned slightly forward, lowered her voice so it carried sharp and clear across the lobby, and warned him, "This is your last chance to do the right thing." The manager scoffed. "Ma'am, you're wasting my time. Security will escort you out if you don't leave." Gasps rippled through the lobby. The audacity of the statement hung in the air. A woman whose wealth could buy the very ground he stood on, denied service and threatened with removal. And that was the mistake that ended his career. Because in the next few minutes, she would do something that no one in that bank expected. Something so swift, so final, that the same people whispering in doubt would soon whisper in awe. The man who thought he controlled the room had no idea he was seconds away from losing everything. She wasn't born into wealth. Her story began in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse, and her father drove buses to keep food on the table. Money was tight, but love was never scarce. Her parents taught her that dignity could not be bought, and that education was the only key no one could take away. She carried those lessons like armor. At 15, while friends were distracted by weekend parties, she was already tutoring neighborhood kids in math and saving every spare dollar for college. By 18, she earned a scholarship to a top university, an opportunity her family celebrated with tears and prayers. She walked onto that campus as the first in her family to ever attend college, and she promised herself she would not be the last. Classes were grueling, professors doubted her at times, and the weight of being the only black woman in the room never left her shoulders. But she refused to shrink. Instead, she raised her hand when others stayed quiet. She built alliances, not walls, and slowly her name began to carry weight in lecture halls and case study competitions. She wasn't just surviving in those rooms, she was leading. After graduation, she entered the corporate world at the very bottom. No shortcuts, no safety nets. Her first desk was shoved into a corner beside the copier. Her first title barely covered rent. But her ideas lit up boardrooms, her strategies saved companies millions, and her ability to solve problems under pressure caught the attention of executives who underestimated her at first glance. She turned every closed door into an opening, proving that talent could silence even the most stubborn prejudice. At least for a while. Years passed and her reputation grew. She founded her own firm, then another. She expanded into technology, logistics, real estate, industries dominated by men who often looked nothing like her. Every step she took was scrutinized, questioned, and doubted. Yet every step she took left undeniable results. By her 40s, she had crossed the billion-dollar mark. She was no longer just a participant in the economy, she was shaping it. But it wasn't only about wealth. She poured millions into scholarships for underprivileged students, built mentorship programs for young Black women in business, and funded housing projects in neighborhoods like the one she grew up in. Her philanthropy was quiet, but relentless. She believed success meant nothing if it wasn't shared. To those who knew her personally, she was a force of kindness as much as she was a force of business. And yet, despite all of it, her skin color still entered the room before her resume did. Time and again, she found herself having to prove what should have been obvious, that she belonged, that she had earned every seat she occupied, every title she carried, every deal she signed. It is this contrast that makes what happened in that bank so haunting. She was a woman used to commanding respect, walking into conference centers where executives leaned forward to hear her analysis, where investors trusted her judgment with billions. And yet, on that day, in a branch of the very bank that held her fortune, she was treated as though she were a criminal. The sting of racism is not always in the slur shouted across a street, nor in the obvious act of exclusion. Sometimes it is in the suspicion that drips from a manager's voice when he asks, "Are you sure this is your account?" Sometimes it is in the way eyes follow you in a space where your presence should not be questioned at all. And sometimes it is in being forced to defend your right to exist in a place you already own. For her, that moment at the bank was not just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of something she had known since childhood. Success does not erase the prejudice carved deep into society. Her billions could not shield her from being profiled. Her empire could not protect her from being doubted. And that is where the story finds its deepest cut. Because she was not simply denied service. She was denied dignity. She stood there, a woman who had spent decades proving herself to the world, only to be told by a stranger with a name tag that she was suspect, that she was not enough, that she could not be trusted. No matter how many barriers she broke, no matter how many records she set, the color of her skin was still seen first. That truth would hang heavy in the air of that bank lobby, and it would become the very reason why what came next carried so much power. She arrived at the branch on a weekday afternoon, her schedule tight, but her purpose simple. It wasn't an unusual errand, just a withdrawal and transfer to cover an upcoming project. For most people with accounts her size, such requests would be routine. In fact, she had done this exact transaction at other branches before, without so much as a raised eyebrow. But the moment she stepped through the revolving glass doors, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations at the counter softened. A man filling out a deposit slip froze, his pen hovering above the paper. A teller whispered something to a colleague before quickly looking away. And near the entrance, the security guard adjusted his stance, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read her intentions before she even reached the counter. She walked forward with calm confidence, carrying only a leather portfolio. To her, this was just another afternoon in the rhythm of business. But to the people watching her, it was as though she had entered a stage where suspicion was the default. The teller she approached gave a polite, uneasy smile. His voice trembled slightly as he asked how he could help. She explained her request clearly, an account withdrawal followed by a transfer, nothing complicated. Yet, instead of following procedure, the teller hesitated. His eyes darted toward the glass office where the branch manager sat, head bent over paperwork. Within seconds, a silent message passed between them. The teller pressed a button under the counter, and the manager emerged. The manager's smile was practiced, polished to look welcoming, but his eyes betrayed something sharper. "Good afternoon," he said, voice carrying a tone that landed somewhere between courtesy and condescension. "And what brings you in today?" She repeated her request. The room seemed to listen in. The pause before his response stretched long, as though he were deciding not how to help her, but whether she deserved help at all. "Do you have additional identification?" he asked, even after she had already provided her card and documents. "Yes," she replied, handing over her driver's license, her name bold on the card, matching the account in question. He studied it longer than necessary. "And this account?" he said slowly. "You're certain it belongs to you?" The words were like a match to dry wood. A few customers turned their heads, stunned to hear such a question. She raised her chin slightly, her eyes unwavering. "I don't think it belongs to me," she said firmly. "I know it does." The manager did not flinch. Instead, he motioned to the teller to step back. "I'll handle this personally," he announced, as though he were dealing with a potential threat instead of a loyal client. From there, the demands multiplied. He wanted additional verification, additional signatures, even documentation that had nothing to do with the request at hand. Each time she met his requirement, he invented another. The longer it went on, the clearer his true intent became. Not to assist her, but to discourage her, to deny her, to remind her that in his eyes, she was not trustworthy. The whispers among the staff grew. A young teller leaned close to another, murmuring with a frown. A customer at the counter asked under his breath, "What's going on?" The tension was no longer subtle, it was obvious, thick enough to choke the air in the lobby. She remained composed, her voice never rising, though her patience was tested with every second that passed. She explained again that the funds were hers, that the transaction was standard. Yet each explanation was met with another obstacle, another smirk, another hint that her presence was unwelcome. At one point, the manager leaned across the counter and said quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You'll understand if we have to be extra cautious. These kinds of amounts can draw the wrong attention." It wasn't the money he doubted, it was her. His eyes swept over her as if to say she didn't look like the type of person who should be handling such sums. She knew this script all too well. No matter the wealth, no matter the title, no matter the recognition, suspicion often arrived first. What angered her most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the insult. She had spent years proving herself in spaces that were not built for her, only to be told again, here, in this ordinary branch, that her word, her identity, her presence wasn't enough. The customers in line shifted uncomfortably, sensing the injustice. Some turned away, not wanting to get involved. Others stayed frozen, unwilling to miss what felt like a confrontation brewing. And through it all, the manager stood tall, arms crossed now, his voice cold. "If you cannot provide further documentation, I'm afraid we cannot complete your request today." The room went silent. The weight of his words pressed down on her, on the staff, on every witness present. A billionaire CEO, treated like a fraud in a place where her wealth and influence should have spoken for themselves. She exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition of what was happening. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a denial. And with each second that passed, the temperature in the room dropped lower. She placed her portfolio on the counter, her gaze unbroken. The warning signs were there, bold and undeniable. This was no longer about a simple withdrawal. This was about something deeper, about a man determined to strip her of dignity, even if it meant breaking the very rules of the institution he represented. And in that lobby, under the watchful eyes of strangers, the line between routine transaction and public humiliation was crossed. The standoff at the counter stretched into an uneasy silence, the weight of it pressing on every corner of the lobby. She had provided her documents. She had confirmed her identity. She had explained the transaction twice over. Yet the manager still held her papers as though he were deciding whether to accept them or toss them aside. Finally, he leaned back, folded his arms, and delivered words designed to wound. "Ma'am, I'm concerned this account may not actually belong to you. The information isn't adding up." Her eyes narrowed. "Everything adds up. The account is in my name. The documents match. You're holding proof in your hands." He shook his head slowly, lips curving into something resembling a smile, but heavy with arrogance. "These kinds of claims are common. People walk in here all the time saying there's someone they're not. I can't just take your word for it." The insult landed like a slap across the room. Customers turned, brows furrowed, some whispering in disbelief. A woman waiting with a checkbook clutched it tighter, muttering, "She showed him her ID." Another customer whispered to his companion, "She looks like she knows exactly what she's doing. Why is he dragging it out?" But the manager wasn't finished. He leaned in, lowering his voice, though it carried across the lobby all the same. If you're attempting fraud, you should know we take these matters very seriously. Attempting to access an account that isn't yours, well, that's a criminal offense. The air seemed to drain out of the room. For a moment, she felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from outrage. Fraud? The very idea was absurd. She owned this account. She owned more accounts than he could probably imagine. Yet here she was, being spoken to like a criminal in front of strangers. "I have been patient," she said evenly. "I've complied with every request. What you're doing right now is unacceptable." He smirked, lifting his chin. "Then you can take your complaint elsewhere. But you're not accessing these funds today." The words echoed, final and sharp. Refusal. Complete denial. Not a suggestion of delay or confusion, an outright barrier, built not from policy, but from prejudice. At the far end of the lobby, the security guard shifted his weight, one hand resting on his belt. The message was clear. The manager wasn't just denying her request, he was positioning her as a threat. Her pulse remained steady, though anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. She had faced dismissals before, investors doubting her, competitors sneering at her success, but this was different. This was not skepticism of an idea. This was a refusal of her very identity. She glanced around the room. Every pair of eyes was on her, some sympathetic, others wide with disbelief, a few choosing to look away. Public humiliation is never private. It strips you layer by layer, until you are reduced to the single thing others have decided defines you. And here, in this branch that held her wealth, she was not seen as a billionaire. She was not seen as an employer of thousands. She was not even seen as a client. She was seen as black, and therefore suspect. The manager's voice rose louder now, deliberate enough to make sure the entire lobby heard. "We cannot process this request. I've seen enough. Security will need to escort you out." Gasps spread like ripples across water. A man near the door muttered, "That's insane." A young woman pulled out her phone, whispering, "This needs to be recorded." The CEO's hands rested firmly on the counter, not trembling, not backing away. Her voice came low, controlled, but it carried a blade's edge. "You are making a grave mistake." But he dismissed her words with a wave of his hand. "Grave mistakes are when fraud goes unchecked. I won't allow it." The guard began moving closer. The sound of his shoes against the tile cut through the thick silence. The image was undeniable. A black woman, powerful beyond measure, being treated like an intruder in a space that depended on her wealth to exist. In that moment, she felt the weight of history pressing against her. Every headline she had read about profiling, every story she had heard from friends who faced humiliation at banks, airports, hotels, it all converged here. Success hadn't shielded her, money hadn't protected her, status hadn't mattered. She was stripped down to what he chose to see, unwelcome. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin as the guard approached. She did not flinch, she did not beg, she did not explain again. Instead, she locked eyes with the manager, a gaze so steady that it forced him to look away for the briefest second. The humiliation was public. The denial was final. But what he didn't realize was that his victory in that moment was nothing more than the opening act of his downfall. Because in less than 10 minutes, the power dynamic would shift entirely. The man who refused her dignity was about to lose far more than control of a bank lobby. The lobby felt frozen, every eye fixed on the scene at the counter. Edith stood with a stillness that radiated authority, but beneath that stillness was a fury no one dared underestimate. For minutes she had tolerated the indignity, jumping through hoops, answering questions designed not to verify but to humiliate, enduring whispers that cut sharper than shouts. But patience has limits, and hers had just been reached. She placed her portfolio squarely on the counter, her movements deliberate, her voice measured. "This is your last chance to correct this mistake." The room seemed to hold its breath. Customers leaned forward, sensing a line had been drawn. Some nodded slightly, as if rooting for her, while others simply watched in silence, unsure of how far this confrontation would go. The manager, however, did not flinch. His lips twisted into something smug, the look of a man convinced he held all the power. "Ma'am, there is no mistake. You don't belong here, and frankly, I don't have time to argue with you." The words cut deeper than the denial itself. "You don't belong here." A verdict delivered not by policy, but by prejudice. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm, her restraint a sharp contrast to his arrogance. "I've given you everything you asked for, identification, account details, documentation. Yet you stand here accusing me of fraud in front of strangers. Understand this, the problem is not my paperwork. The problem is you." Murmurs rippled through the lobby. A man near the line whispered to his wife, "She's right, he's dragging this out." A college student recording on his phone shook his head, muttering, "He's gonna regret this." But the manager only grew more emboldened, his chest puffing with the false confidence of someone who believed authority was his shield. "If you don't leave willingly, security will handle it," he said flatly. "We don't need disruptions in this branch." The audacity stunned even the tellers, who exchanged nervous glances behind their counters. They knew her name, knew the magnitude of who she was, yet they stood silent, trapped between their recognition of her power and their fear of his authority. Her gaze never wavered. Her stillness was not weakness, it was the warning before the storm. "You have chosen arrogance over truth. I will give you one more opportunity. Reverse this now or accept the consequences." For a brief moment, the manager's face flickered with doubt. But pride is a dangerous thing. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though trying to reclaim control. "Consequences? The only consequences here will be for you if you keep pressing this charade. You'll leave this branch with nothing." The words hung heavy, drenched in condescension, spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who believed racism could hide behind the mask of procedure. Her silence stretched long enough to make even the guard pause mid-step. She was calculating, not her worth, not her defense, but the exact second to act. A mother in line clutched her child's hand and whispered, "He doesn't know who she is, does he?" And then, with the weight of the entire room pressing in, she reached into her bag and drew out her phone. Her fingers moved without rush, her expression composed, her authority unmistakable. The simple act of dialing carried more power than anything the manager had said all afternoon. The lobby seemed to quiet, the low hum of the printers and chatter at the counters fading into the background. Every witness sensed it. Something irreversible was about to happen. The manager scoffed, his bravado unshaken. "Go ahead, call whoever you think you need. It won't change a thing." His tone dripped with dismissiveness, but the slight tremor in his jaw betrayed the first crack in his armor. She lifted the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice, steady and deliberate, broke the tension with a calm authority that silenced even the whispers. "It will change everything." And in that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted, not with shouts, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that he had underestimated her. And that's when she made the call that changed everything. The guard, once sure of his role, hesitated mid-step. The customers leaned in closer, phones raised to capture what they sensed would not be forgotten. The tellers, silent until now, exchanged glances of dread. They could feel it. This was no longer about a denied transaction. This was about to become history. The manager, still clinging to his illusion of control, straightened his tie and crossed his arms. But deep down, the unease had already taken root. He had pushed too far, and everyone in that lobby could see it. She stood poised, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice calm yet unyielding. She had endured enough. She had drawn the line, and with that call she was about to show him, and the entire bank, what true power looked like. Her finger pressed the screen, the phone ringing once, then twice. The manager stood tall, arms folded, pretending to be unmoved, yet a bead of sweat formed just above his brow. He masked it with a smirk, but the cracks in his confidence were visible to anyone paying attention. The call connected. Her tone was calm, not frantic, not pleading, commanding. "This is Mrs. Edith Miley. I'm at your branch right now. Your manager has refused to honor my request, questioned my identity, and attempted to remove me from the premises. I suggest you resolve this immediately." The room went still. Not a whisper, not a cough, not a shuffle. Every person in that lobby understood something the manager had not. She was not just another customer, she was the customer. Her voice carried steady authority as she laid out the facts. The pause on the other end of the line was brief, followed by urgency. "Stay where you are," the voice said. "We're escalating this right now." The manager tried to laugh it off. "Who exactly do you think you're talking to? Calling friends won't change bank policy." She lowered the phone just slightly, enough for him to hear the voice still speaking through the receiver, the unmistakable tone of an executive. The words cut through the air, audible to those closest by. "Is this true? Did our manager just deny you service?" Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not of amusement, but of certainty. She lifted the phone again. "Yes, he did." The tellers behind the counter paled. They exchanged anxious glances, realizing this had spiraled beyond their control. The guard, once standing firm, now looked uncertain, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Within minutes, the lobby phone at the manager's desk rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. He froze, his smirk vanishing. Slowly, he turned toward his office. Another ring. Customers watched, eyes wide, as if they too knew that his reckoning had arrived. He picked up the receiver, voice suddenly smaller than before. Yes, this is him. His posture stiffened as the voice on the other end unleashed words sharp as glass. His responses grew clipped, defensive. I was only following procedure she couldn't verify. His excuses wilted under the force of authority he could no longer dismiss. Meanwhile, she stood exactly where she had been, unshaken. The crowd watched her not as a victim anymore, but as someone reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped away minutes before. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't caused chaos, she had simply used the power she had earned. The manager's voice faltered. Yes, I understand. Immediately. He hung up, his hands trembling slightly, the phone clattering against the desk louder than he intended. He returned to the counter, his face drained of color, his arrogance gone. But before he could speak, her phone rang again. She answered promptly, her tone steady. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, a senior executive, his words loud enough for the lobby to hear. We want to apologize directly. What happened is unacceptable. That manager has been relieved of duty, effective immediately. Please know, this is being documented for a full investigation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman in line whispered, he just got fired. The young man recording on his phone nodded, whispering back on the spot. She closed the call, slipping the phone back into her bag. The manager stood there, stripped of his former bravado, his mouth opening as if to explain, then closing again, realizing there was nothing left to defend. The silence stretched heavy, then shattered as one of the customers clapped once, the sound echoing in the vaulted lobby. Others joined in, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't applause of celebration, it was applause of recognition. They had witnessed justice unfold in real time. She turned to gather her documents, sliding them neatly back into her portfolio. Her movements were calm, deliberate, controlled. The same control she had exhibited when she walked in was still there, but now it was sharpened by vindication. The teller scrambled to offer apologies, their words tumbling over each other. We're so sorry. This shouldn't have happened. But she simply raised her hand, silencing them without a word. The time for apologies had passed. Her eyes returned to the manager one final time. This didn't happen because of policy. It happened because of prejudice, and prejudice has consequences. The guard shifted uncomfortably, lowering his eyes to the ground. The staff avoided her gaze. The customers, however, stared openly, some with admiration, others with shame that they hadn't spoken up sooner. In that moment, the billionaire was made invisible, stripped down to just another black woman, unwelcome, in a place her wealth built. But with one call, she reminded them, and the world, that her presence could not be erased. The balance of power had shifted. The humiliation she endured had been turned into accountability, swift and undeniable. And for the manager who had mocked her, questioned her, and attempted to expel her, the end had come faster than he could have ever imagined. The moment the branch phone clicked back into its cradle, the atmosphere inside the bank shifted. The man who had strutted with smug authority only minutes earlier now looked smaller, his posture collapsing beneath the weight of accountability. The arrogance had drained from his face, leaving only shock. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. We'll revisit this matter another time. His voice lacked conviction. It cracked under the pressure of eyes that no longer saw him as the enforcer, but as the condemned. She said nothing at first. She simply stood with her portfolio in hand, her gaze fixed firmly on him. That silence carried more power than any speech. The crowd watched as he fumbled, the reality dawning that his title could no longer shield him. One of the tellers received a message on their terminal, their face blanching as they read it. Their eyes darted to the manager, then back to her. The instruction had arrived. He was to be relieved of his duties immediately. The guard, still hovering close by, looked to the staff for direction. None came. The authority in that lobby had already shifted. The man in charge no longer was. She finally broke the silence. Her voice was calm, steady, undeniable. You accused me of fraud. You denied me access to my own account. You humiliated me in front of witnesses, and now you stand stripped of the power you misused. The manager's lips trembled. I was following. No, she interrupted sharply. You weren't following policy, you were following prejudice. And today, prejudice cost you your career. Her words cut through the room like glass, and no one dared to contradict her. Even those who had stayed silent earlier now nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth they had all seen unfold. The teller who had first tried to assist her finally spoke, their voice soft but audible. He shouldn't have treated you that way. We all knew it. The manager turned toward them, his face twisting with disbelief. You. He started, but stopped himself, realizing his allies had vanished. Another customer, emboldened, spoke up from the line. "I've banked here for years. I've never seen someone treated like that. Shameful." The murmurs grew. What had once been a silent audience was now a jury, and the verdict was unanimous. The branch manager was guilty, not of a clerical error, but of weaponizing his position against a black woman whose success challenged his prejudice. And then the final blow landed. The senior executive's voice, still on the phone at the side desk, was put on speaker by one of the tellers. His words carried across the lobby with authority no one could deny. "Effective immediately, Mike Banks, your employment with this institution is terminated. Your actions today were discriminatory, unacceptable, and will be reported for further review. Security will collect your credentials." The guard hesitated, stunned, but protocol was protocol. He stepped forward, not to remove her, but to remove him. Gasps spread again, followed by the shuffle of customers pulling out their phones to capture the reversal. The man who had wielded his authority like a weapon was now being escorted out, stripped of his badge, his name tag collected like evidence of a crime. His protests were weak, desperate. "This isn't fair. I was protecting the bank. I was just doing my job." But no one listened. Fairness had left the room when he accused her of fraud. Justice had returned when the tables turned. She stood tall, her expression calm, her voice unwavering as she addressed him one last time. "Remember this moment. Remember how quickly the power you abused disappeared. You thought you could define me by suspicion. Now, your career will forever be defined by this disgrace." The guard guided him toward the exit, his protests fading with each step until the doors closed behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. For the first time since she walked in, the staff turned their full attention to her, not with suspicion, but with respect. Apologies tumbled from their mouths, promises that this would be reported, that new training would be enforced, that change would come. She listened, but gave no response. Their words were not for her. They were for themselves, a desperate attempt to absolve guilt. She had no interest in their excuses. What mattered was the message delivered in real time. Racism in this space had cost a man his career, and everyone who had witnessed it would leave with that image burned into memory. A customer near the front clapped once again, this time joined by more voices, more hands. It was not joyous applause, but recognition. A shared understanding that they had seen a system momentarily corrected, a prejudice exposed and punished. Her response was simple. She gathered her papers, adjusted her jacket, and spoke with measured clarity. "I will ensure this does not happen again. Not here. Not anywhere in this institution." Those words weren't just a statement, they were a promise. And as she stepped away from the counter, the lobby parted for her, not because she demanded it, but because they all understood. She had entered as a target. She was leaving as a force. The branch doors swung open, sunlight spilling across the marble floor. Behind her, whispers buzzed, phones clicked off, and a disgraced manager's absence loomed large. Ahead of her, the next steps were already forming, steps that would shake more than one branch, more than one manager, more than one policy. Because what had happened here wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something bigger. And she was determined to tear it out by the root. News doesn't always travel slowly. Sometimes it spreads like fire, hungry, unstoppable, devouring everything in its path. That afternoon, what happened inside a single bank branch became more than an isolated confrontation. It became a story people couldn't look away from. It started with a single video. The college student who had been quietly recording in line uploaded a clip less than 2 minutes long. It showed the manager denying her service, calling her fraudulent, then being stripped of his position and escorted out. Within an hour, the video gathered thousands of views. By the end of the day, it had climbed into the millions. The captions told the story plain and raw. Billionaire CEO denied access to her own account. Manager fired on the spot. On social media, the comments came in waves. If this can happen to her, what about the rest of us? She had money, power, and proof. He still treated her like she didn't belong. This is why black clients don't trust banks. The branch itself turned into a symbol, an address whispered on live streams, a backdrop for reporters who crowded the sidewalk the next morning. The bank's logo appeared on headlines across the country, not for growth or success, but for disgrace. Inside corporate headquarters, panic set in. Executives scrambled to draft statements, meetings were held late into the night, lawyers reviewed policies, but nothing could undo the damage. The video had already spoken louder than any press release. For ordinary people watching, the story struck a nerve. This wasn't just about one CEO or one branch manager. It was about the unspoken rules people of color lived with every day. The constant suspicion, the raised eyebrows, the barriers built on prejudice rather than policy. A woman in Chicago posted, "They told me once my signature didn't match. I had to bring my father to prove I owned my own account. Watching her stand her ground gave me strength I wish I had that day." A man in Atlanta wrote, "They laughed when I tried to open a business account. Said I didn't look like a serious client. Now look at this. Proof it's not just me." The story tapped into memories long buried, each one echoing the same truth. Success doesn't shield you from racism. Not in airports, not in restaurants, not even in banks holding your fortune. Reporters lined up outside her office demanding comment. She issued a statement both measured and powerful. "This was not just about me. This was about every person who has been denied dignity at a counter, a desk, or a doorway. Racism in service is not a mistake, it is a pattern, and patterns must be broken." Her words struck deep. They weren't angry outbursts, they were truth wrapped in clarity, and people listened. The bank, desperate to contain the fallout, announced a sweeping review. They promised new training, new oversight, new accountability measures. But skeptics were quick to point out that this wasn't the first incident, nor would it be the last without real systemic change. Meanwhile, the fired manager's name trended briefly online, not out of sympathy, but as an example of arrogance undone. His face, once smug behind the counter, was now plastered on memes with captions like, "Denied a billionaire. Lost his job in 10 minutes. The humiliation that had been meant for her had rebounded, full force, onto him. For communities across the country, her story became a rallying cry. Churches mentioned it in sermons, activists held forums around it, classrooms debated it. What some saw as an isolated scandal was, in truth, a mirror held up to society's face. And through it all, she remained steady. She gave one interview, her words precise. "I don't stand taller because of the money I've made. I stand taller because no one has the right to deny me or anyone else dignity." Her refusal to let the incident be swept aside turned the story from gossip into a lesson. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And accountability, she made clear, was overdue. The video didn't just show a manager's downfall, it showed the world a truth many already knew. Racism doesn't care about titles, paychecks, or power, and if it can strip dignity from a billionaire, what chance does it give anyone else? The story kept growing. By the end of the week, major outlets were running features on discrimination in the financial sector. Statistics surfaced, stories were shared, the spotlight refused to dim. And at the center of it all was one woman, standing unflinching in the storm. The fallout had reached further than anyone in that bank lobby could have predicted, and she was just getting started. The video might have embarrassed the branch, but her next steps would shake the entire institution. She understood something the executives at headquarters did not. Public apologies fade quickly, but structural change endures. If this incident was left as a single firing, the problem would simply resurface elsewhere. She had no intention of letting that happen. The morning after the incident, she called a meeting with the bank's top leadership. They dialed in from polished boardrooms and offices lined with mahogany shelves, their voices careful, their apologies scripted. They expected her to accept contrition, perhaps even a settlement or a ceremonial partnership to restore the bank's reputation. Instead, she opened the meeting with a line that stunned them into silence. "What happened to me yesterday is happening to your customers every day. The difference is, I had the power to make the world watch. They don't, and if you want to survive this scandal, you'll fix it at the root." Her conditions were clear and uncompromising. She demanded a full diversity audit across every branch in the country. External investigators hired to review not just policy, but practice. She insisted on a zero-tolerance system for discriminatory behavior, tied directly to performance evaluations for managers. She called for scholarship funds, training programs, and investments in underserved communities equal to the bank's record quarterly profits. An executive tried to push back, his voice tight. "With all due respect, this sounds excessive. We've already fired the individual responsible. Surely." She cut him off with a calm precision. "Excessive is being called a criminal in your own bank. Excessive is being denied service despite flawless paperwork. Excessive is watching thousands of people online recognize their own humiliation in mine. If you think firing one man solves this, you're not listening." Her words hit with the weight of undeniable truth. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, realizing this was no longer a negotiation. This was a mandate. As the meeting continued, she laid out her strategy. She would use her platform and her wealth to make sure the story didn't fade. She would speak at conferences, testify at hearings, and publish op-eds linking her experience to broader systemic failures. And she would not hesitate to pull her company's accounts, billions of dollars in assets, if they failed to comply. For the first time, the executives grasped the scale of the threat. Losing her was not just a PR crisis. It was financial devastation. Her companies touched too many sectors, her influence too wide. The choice before them was clear: change or collapse. Within days, the bank issued a sweeping announcement. They pledged a national review of all practices, overseen by independent watchdogs. They committed to rolling out new client protection policies, publishing quarterly reports on compliance, and building a permanent office for equity and accountability. The press release credited leadership for taking bold steps. But everyone knew the truth. Those steps existed only because a black woman refused to accept humiliation in silence. The public reaction was immediate. Some praised the bank for its reforms, others remained skeptical. But the narrative centered on her resolve. She had not simply stood up for herself. She had forced an entire industry giant to bend. Community leaders invited her to speak at town halls. Activists highlighted her strategy as a blueprint for confronting racism in corporate spaces. Young professionals saw in her a model of resistance that was both dignified and devastatingly effective. And yet, she never framed her actions as heroic. In interviews, she was consistent. "I didn't do this for applause. I did this because I could. And if I didn't, who would? My silence would have allowed the same abuse to continue, unchecked. My voice makes sure the next person isn't left powerless at the counter." Her refusal to be placated resonated even more deeply because it spoke to a lived reality. Many who watched her story unfold saw themselves, not in her billions, but in the suspicion she endured. And they felt vindicated by the fact that, for once, the story ended not with apology alone, but with structural consequence. She didn't just fire one man. She forced a corporation to admit its failure. She showed that racism inside an institution is not an accident, it is a design, and designs can be torn apart. The bank's changes became front-page news. Analysts debated the financial cost, shareholders demanded explanations. Competitors scrambled to review their own practices, fearing similar exposure. What started as one act of prejudice in a single branch had become a catalyst for industry-wide reform. She had turned humiliation into leverage. She had turned suspicion into accountability. And she had reminded the world that dignity once denied can be reclaimed with force. But this was not the end of the story. For the woman at the center of it all, the most powerful outcome was still ahead. The response from ordinary people whose lives were touched by her stand. The reforms made headlines, but the true impact unfolded far from boardrooms and press releases. It unfolded in living rooms, classrooms, church halls, and phone calls late at night between friends who had carried silent scars for years. People who had long buried their experiences suddenly found words. Her stand against the manager had unlocked something larger, a permission to speak. A grandmother in Detroit, who once had her savings account closed without explanation, told her daughter, "Now you see why I never trusted them. But maybe things can change." A college student in Dallas posted online, "They questioned me when I tried to cash my paycheck, like I forged it. Watching her stand her ground makes me feel like I don't have to shrink next time." Letters began to arrive at her office. Some were handwritten, trembling with emotion. Others neatly typed, full of detail. One said, "Your story gave me the courage to file a complaint I should have filed years ago." Another read, "Thank you for showing the world what we go through daily, even when we're not billionaires." She read every single one. Some made her weep, others made her clench her jaw in anger. All of them reminded her that her humiliation at the counter was not an exception, but a reflection. In interviews, she refused to make the story about herself. "This is not just my story," she said. "It is our story. I had the means to hold them accountable. Many do not. That's why I have to keep going." Her refusal to claim the spotlight as a personal triumph deepened the resonance. People began to see her not just as a billionaire CEO, but as a mirror of their own struggles, magnified to a scale the world could no longer deny. At town halls, people stood to share their stories. A young father in Atlanta described being denied a loan despite perfect credit. A nurse in Baltimore recounted how she was treated as though she couldn't possibly understand her own finances. Each story carried the same refrain: if it can happen to her, it can happen to any of us. The movement didn't end with words. Community organizations began documenting cases more systematically, pushing banks to reveal data on who was being denied service and why. Activists used her case as leverage in lawsuits, citing it as proof of systemic bias. Politicians raised questions in hearings, pressing for legislative oversight. And through it all, her presence remained steady. She did not attend every rally or sign every petition, but her story hovered like a banner above them. It was the anchor people pointed to when asked why change was needed. She carried the humiliation of one day so that countless others could carry the hope of tomorrow. The story sparked personal courage as well. In one viral post, a young woman shared how she challenged a teller who treated her with condescension. "I told him straight, I know who I am and I deserve to be treated with respect. I never would have said that before seeing her." There was power in those ripples. What began in one lobby was now a current stretching across states, across communities, across generations. Not everyone applauded, of course. There were critics who dismissed the incident as exaggerated, who insisted racism wasn't at play, who claimed she was pulling the race card. But their voices were drowned out by the sheer volume of lived experiences people poured into the public square. Too many had endured too much for denial to stick. The echoes reached even those who once thought themselves powerless. A teenager in Newark wrote anonymously online, "My mom always said, don't make a scene, just take it and walk away. But now I know silence doesn't change anything." And that was the heart of it. Silence had been broken. Not just by her call to headquarters, but by the chorus that followed. In speeches, she framed it this way: "This isn't about punishing one man. It's about dismantling a mindset. A mindset that says some of us will always be doubted first, served last, and questioned always. That mindset is not just wrong, it's dangerous. And it will end." Her words did more than soothe. They ignited. They created a narrative that was no longer about wealth or status, but about dignity and justice. For many, her stand became a turning point. Not because it erased racism overnight, but because it proved resistance was possible. She had taken an act meant to strip her of power and turned it into a movement that gave others theirs. And as the weeks passed, her story stopped being just a scandal of one bank. It became a symbol of something larger, proof that even in the face of humiliation, dignity could rise, speak, and echo far beyond the walls where it had once been denied. In the weeks that followed, the incident became more than just a headline. It became a litmus test for where people stood on the question of race and dignity in America. The video circulated across every platform, dissected in talk shows, podcasts, and classrooms. Each replay carried with it not just the humiliation she endured, but the stunning reversal that followed. People didn't just watch the manager's downfall. They replayed the moment she stood calm, unwavering, when everything in the room was stacked against her. They analyzed her stillness, her refusal to bow, her insistence that the line had been crossed. That image stuck, lingering longer than the scandal itself. Letters poured in. Some came from strangers who had endured the same. A single mother in Los Angeles wrote, "They told me to step aside while they verified my check. They never asked the man in line before me for the same. Watching you refuse to accept that treatment made me realize I wasn't crazy. It was racism, plain and simple." Others came from allies who admitted they hadn't seen the depth of the problem until that day. "I never understood how constant suspicion feels until I saw you treated that way. Now I can't unsee it." The story wasn't just sparking empathy, it was demanding self-reflection. In living rooms and offices, people asked hard questions. How many times have I witnessed bias and said nothing? How many times have I assumed someone was out of place when they weren't? Her story became a mirror, and when people looked into it, they saw themselves, not always comfortably. Community forums sprang up in cities across the country. People used her experience as a starting point to share their own. Stories spilled out, heavy with years of silence. The cashier who triple-checked IDs, the loan officer who mysteriously lost paperwork, the teller who suggested smaller withdrawals to avoid issues. Each voice added weight to the truth. Racism in service wasn't random, it was systemic. And yet, amid the pain, something else began to grow. Hope. Because for once, the narrative didn't end with defeat. It ended with accountability. The sight of a bank manager escorted out while the very woman he tried to humiliate stood tall. That image carried power far beyond a single lobby. It told people that resistance was not futile, that prejudice could be confronted and exposed, that silence could be broken. Her dignity in that lobby was more than personal. It became collective. She showed that standing firm, even when isolated, can ripple into change far larger than the moment itself. Social media was full of reflections. I showed my daughter this video, told her, "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." I shared this with my coworkers. We need to talk about how we treat people who don't look like us. This wasn't just her fight, it was all of ours. For many, the story brought an uncomfortable realization. If a billionaire could be treated like a criminal, then ordinary people were even more vulnerable. It forced a reckoning, not only with institutions, but with personal responsibility. Clergy invoked her stand in sermons about justice. Teachers used it to spark discussions about equity in classrooms. Activists pointed to it as proof that public accountability works when silence is broken. And in the quiet corners of homes, parents told their children, "This is why you can't afford to let your guard down. But also, this is why you must never accept humiliation as normal." Her story became both warning and inspiration. A warning that prejudice does not disappear with success, and an inspiration that resilience can turn even the harshest humiliation into victory. For the audience watching, the reflection cut deep. What would you have done if you had been in that lobby? Would you have spoken up? Pulled out your phone? Challenged the manager? Or would you have turned away, pretending not to notice? The questions lingered, pressing on the conscience of everyone who heard the story. Because this was not just about one woman's stand, it was about the choices ordinary people make when confronted with injustice in everyday spaces. Her power move forced a corporation to change. But the lasting power of her story lay in how it challenged individuals to change themselves. And for those listening now, the challenge remains the same. Silence is not neutral. Injustice thrives on silence. The only way to strip it of power is to refuse to stand idle when it happens. The echoes of that day still resound, not only in policies rewritten, but in hearts reawakened. The bank lobby had emptied long ago, but the echoes of that afternoon did not fade. They lived on in headlines, in conversations, in the memories of everyone who had witnessed a humiliation flipped into justice. The woman who entered expecting a simple transaction had walked out with something far greater. Proof that silence could be broken, that prejudice could be punished, and that dignity, once stripped, could be reclaimed. Her story was not just about money, nor was it just about power. It was about visibility. For 1 hour in one branch, she was treated as though her achievements, her reputation, her humanity meant nothing. And yet, in less than 10 minutes, the tables turned. The man who sought to deny her dignity lost the very career he had built on authority. They tried to erase her presence. They ended up erasing their own. That is the truth of racism in everyday life. It doesn't always shout with slurs or violence. Sometimes it whispers through suspicion, through demands that don't apply to others, through refusals dressed up as policy. It hides in plain sight, hoping no one will challenge it. But when it is confronted, when it is exposed, it cannot withstand the light. Her stand was not about revenge. It was about accountability. She didn't storm out. She didn't raise her voice. She simply drew a line. And when that line was crossed, she used the power she had earned to redraw the rules for everyone. That is what made her story resonate. She didn't just fight for herself. She fought for every person who has ever been told, "You don't belong here." Every person who has ever had to prove themselves twice over. Every person who has ever watched dignity slip away in spaces where it should have been automatic. The image of her standing steady as the manager was escorted out is one that lingers. It is a reminder that no matter how much prejudice tries to strip away, dignity can be reclaimed with courage. For those watching, the lesson is clear. Racism thrives in silence. It feeds on the hope that no one will speak up, that humiliation will be endured quietly, that injustice will remain unseen. But silence is not neutral. It is consent. And consent is what gives prejudice its power. Her story broke that silence. And because of that, policies changed, conversations deepened, and thousands of ordinary people found the courage to say, "Not anymore." The question now is not just what she did, but what you would do. If you had been in that lobby, would you have stood by quietly? Or would you have spoken up, raised your phone, and refused to let injustice pass unchallenged? These are not abstract questions. They matter because this story is not rare. It happens every day, in banks, in stores, in restaurants, at workplaces. The difference is that most incidents are not caught on camera, and most victims do not have the power to reverse the humiliation so swiftly. But each of us has a choice. Each of us has a voice. And each of us can decide whether to stand silent or stand firm. The story of the billionaire CEO is a warning, but it is also a call. A call to recognize that racism does not fade with success. A call to see prejudice for what it is, no matter how politely it is dressed. And a call to act, not later, not tomorrow, but in the moment it unfolds. Her words remain etched into the memory of that day. This isn't policy, this is prejudice, and prejudice has consequences. It is a sentence we all can carry with us, not just as a rebuke but as a promise that when dignity is denied, consequences will follow. And so the story ends where it began. Not with money, not with power, but with dignity. Dignity denied, dignity defended, dignity reclaimed. Now, to everyone watching, have you ever been treated unfairly in a place where you thought you belonged? Have you ever been made to feel invisible when you should have been recognized? Share your story in the comments. Let your voice join the chorus that says silence is not an option. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that justice can rise even in the most ordinary spaces, subscribe to this channel. Because here, we tell the stories that matter, the stories that expose injustice, but also reveal strength. She walked into that bank as a target, she walked out as a symbol, and her story now in your hands lives on as a reminder. Dignity cannot be denied forever.